The feminist movement was not exactly a new concept in the 1970s, but rather a new edition of a movement that has been deeply rooted in American society for generations. After the ratification of women's right to vote in the 1920s, the women's movement spent several decades out of the spotlight, but its rising popularity in the 60s and 70s brought it back into mainstream media. Referred to as second wave feminism, this movement sought to generate real societal change and create a sense of equality amongst the genders. It is widely believed that the women's movement was kick-started by the publication of Betty Friedan's book The Feminine Mystique, in which she critiqued the traditional female identity and societal expectations for women. With rising support for this culture of change, the women's movement accelerated at incredible speeds through the following decades. In addition to Friedan's book, second-wave feminism and the sexual revolution also tend to find their roots in the civil rights movement, where they hoped that the changes made for African Americans could also inspire a new wave of changes for women. At this time, the movement had a fairly straightforward goal of ending workplace inequality, and the push for a change of social roles didn't follow until later. In fact, one of the original pieces of legislature that the movement changed was adding a prohibition on gender discrimination into the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Though this idea received some opposition, it passed alongside the Civil Rights Act in 1964 with Title VII prohibiting the discrimination of women in the workforce. This was the first major victory for second-wave feminism, and in the wake of this event, the movement grew even more. While the Civil Rights Act granted legislative protection from discrimination against women under certain circumstances, the battle for true equality was far from over. After the Civil Rights Act, the movement became directed towards social equality and defining a whole new generation of feminists. Beliefs began to evolve and become more radical as the birth control pill was legalized in the 1960s, and abortion was legalized in a 7-2 Supreme Court vote in the Roe v. Wade case in 1973, inspiring women to take control of their own bodies and embrace their sexuality. The legalization of the birth control pill was an incredibly controversial topic, despite helping thousands of women in the country. In 1965, the pill was still illegal in some parts of the country, and the Supreme Court case Griswold v. Connecticut investigated the moral stature of outlawing contraceptives. It was ruled that governmental interference in a woman's decision of whether or not to take birth control violated the right to marital privacy, and with a 7-2 decision, the pill became legal nationwide. Women began defining themselves and their sexuality in ways that the world had never seen before, and grew to challenge the traditional role of the demure housewife that had been widely seen as the cultural norm in America. By having the freedom to choose whether or not they would have children, women were able to choose to stay in jobs for a long period of time without having to take time off for maternity leave, and their presence in the workforce grew even stronger throughout this time. According to the U.S. Department of Labor, about 38% of the labor force in the 1970s was comprised of women, a statistic that has grown up to around 45% as of 2012. With the increased amount of women in the workforce in the early 70s, feminists still craved change on a larger scale. They wanted to finally pass the Equal Rights Amendment, a proposition that had been introduced by suffragist Alice Paul in 1923 after women gained the right to vote, but it had failed to gain enough support to become law. In 1972, the amendment was re-proposed and ended up passing through both houses of Congress and was awaiting the ratification of the states when Phyllis Schlafly, the leader of an extremely conservative group called the Eagle Forum, created a huge opposition to it. The Equal Rights Amendment's deadline for ratification was March of 1979, and Schlafly fought viciously to ensure that it didn't have the necessary approval by that time. Armed with the idea that the amendment would infringe upon a woman's ability to be protected by her husband, and that the traditional role of the female would be completely desecrated, Schlafly's fight ended up leaving the proposition with only 35 of the 38 state ratifications it would have needed in order to pass. The ERA was brought before Congress yet again in 1982, and has been before every session of Congress since then, but still has not been passed. One of the biggest challenges faced by the women's movement then, and still today, was getting the rest of the population to take them seriously. Women had been regarded as inferior for such an extended period of time that the movement struggled to take a firm root in the male-driven society. Many feminists were portrayed as, quote, humorless, ugly, man-hating shrews, and it was necessary to alter this image in order to gain traction. Exposing the reality of second-wave feminism to the media was key in advancing the movement, and activists like Gloria Steinem and Germaine Greer fought to change the image of the movement through writings and public appearances. Though the movement never had a specific leader that guided its overall course, Steinem and Greer, along with Friedan, are considered to be some of the unofficial leaders of second-wave feminism, as their activism in the media carried the cause to new heights. The 1960s and 70s were a huge step forward in the feminist movement. And while we still have not achieved a complete equality today, the actions taken to promote equality and women's freedom of self expression have helped define how we view them in modern society. Most importantly, the sexual revolution and the legalization of both birth control and abortion have allowed women to define themselves as concrete members of society with autonomy and control over their own bodies, which has shaped the state of modern feminism and laid the foundation for a path to true equality of the sexes.